am Cherrymae. Today, we will be discussing the continuation of our topic last time, which is all about multilingualism, indigenization, and creolization. In our previous discussion, we had tackled about the topic indigenization, and at this moment, we will be talking about creolization. Creolization is the process in which Creole cultures emerge in the New World. According to a social scientist known as Ruben Cohen, Creolization gives birth to new cultural identities and cultures that are entirely different from the original cultures of the various communities. Creolization has led to the enrichment of cultures. However, it has also led to the loss of cultural practices that uniquely identified people in the past. Creolization has three main points. First, the term creolization refers to the development of a new language and or culture as a consequence of linguistic and cultural contact, according to Sigel 2005. Second, in linguistics, this new language is called a Creole. Third, like indigenization, creolization has occurred mainly in the context of colonialism, but in this case, most often where people of various languages and cultures were transported to colonies as slaves or indentured workers. In the 1970s, the term Creole was widely adopted by linguists who use it to denote a contact language or pidgin that is spoken as a first language by subsequent generations. Creole languages resulted from the acquisition of the languages of dominant groups by subordinate groups. The new language exhibited phonological changes and simplified grammar among other changes. Going to the third main point of creolization, Creole languages are vernacular languages that developed in colonial European plantation settlements in the 17th and 18th centuries as a result of contact between groups that spoke mutually unintelligible languages. Creole languages most often emerged in colonies located near the coast of the Atlantic Ocean or the Indian Ocean. Like indigenization, creolization does not refer to a particular linguistic process, but rather to the combined results of several processes that occur in a particular social context. Some of these individual psycholinguistic processes, especially transfer and reduction, are similar, as well as the social processes of mixing, leveling, and the emergence of local norms. However, in creolization, the results of these processes differ in degree and impact from those in indigenization. Creolization. The colonial language was initially used for communication in the colony between the colonizers and speakers of indigenous and imported languages, that is, the substrate languages. These substrate languages refers to the language of the subordinate groups, which has the lower power or the lower prestige. But in contrast to indigenization, formal education was rare and the majority of substrate speakers did not learn much of the colonial language other than some of its vocabulary. It was a new language they developed using this vocabulary, not the colonial language itself, that became the lingua franca among substrate speakers, and this was eventually learned by speakers of the colonial language themselves. The most important factor that differentiates creolization from indigenization is the lack of widespread bilingualism in the colonial language. In Creoles, very few linguistic features other than the lexicon are derived from the colonial language. There is a lack of continuity because the speakers develop a new language using the vocabulary, not the colonial language itself. Then, Creoles are considered as separate languages although lexified by the colonial language. This means that the Creole language is born out of a mixture of several various languages, but the language is stable and natural, and it possesses a completely developed system of grammar as well as vocabulary. Next, Creoles are by definition mother tongues and often the only language of their speakers. Because Creole don't have any native speakers since they were used for convenience in specific circumstances, with its sides still using their native tongue outside these specific interactions. In creolization, a new language is born out of its lexifiers. Lexifiers means the dominant language that serves as the basis for most of its vocabulary. Now, let's move on to socio-historical context for Creole formation. There are two main views about the socio-historical context that bring about creolization. First, Each Creole descended from a pre-existing restricted Pidgin language, that's according to CJL 2008. Second, in the earliest stages of language contact in the colonies, bilingualism was common. That's from Chodinson 2001. The first view stated that a restricted Pidgin is a language that develops for communication among groups who do not have a common language. This Pidgin is defined as originally a language that typically developed out of sporadic and limited contacts between Europeans and non-Europeans in locations other than Europe from the 16th through the early 19th century, and often in association with activities such as trade, plantation, agriculture, and mining. Typical Pidgins function as lingua francas or means for intergroup communication, but not as vernaculars, which are usually defined as language varieties used for ordinary interactions that occur outside a business context. Pidgins have no native speakers, as the population that use them during occasional trade contacts maintain their own vernaculars for intergroup communication. Continuation, the first view had stated that it has a small lexicon and few, if any, grammatical markers. The scenario in the colonial context is that plantation slaves, for example, had only limited exposure to the lexifier, the colonial language, and learned mainly its vocabulary. The only common language they had was this limited knowledge of the lexifier, which they used for basic communication among themselves. Eventually, certain conventions emerged, which had little continuity with the lexifier, and this stabilized to form a new language, a Pidgin. The Pidgin was then learned as a second or auxiliary language by newcomers. As it came to be used more frequently, its use was extended into more and more functions, and it became the primary language for some speakers. An example is found in Hawaii. In the late 1800s, indentured plantation laborers came from China, Portugal, Japan, and many other countries, and Hawaii Pidgin English emerged. The following example shows the absence of a complementizer. A complementizer means a word that introduces a clause, especially a subordinate clause. The examples also shows absence of tense and aspect markers. As what you can see in this sentence, today go courthouse buy license, go church make merry. In English, today I'm going to the courthouse to buy a license and going to a church to get married. That's from Roberts 2005. By the early 1900s, this Pidgin had developed a complementizer, although one different from that of English. So here's how it sounds. You speak you want one good Japanese man for make cook. In English, you said you wanted a good Japanese man to cook. This is still used in modern Hawaii Creole, which also has tense and aspect markers that differ from those of English, such as preverbal when, marking past tense. As in example below, both phonemic and etymological orthographies are used for Hawaii Creole. Examples are given as they appear in published sources. In the sentence, I went try fu catch the word when was used as a preverbal marking past tense, which is in English means I tried to catch it by Sakuda and Siegel 2003. The second view stated that the scenario was, for example, that early settlers in French colonies live in small homesteads with only a few slaves, and the two groups interacted with each other, enabling the slaves to acquire the lexifier, which is the colonial language French. Therefore, there was continuity and no development of a Pidgin predecessor. Only in the later stages did the lexifier become less accessible. For example, the rapid influx of new slaves, then it became incrementally changed or restructured according to conventional principles of language change, as newly arrived slaves learned only approximations of the language from other slaves. For example, according to Chodinson 2001, states that Creolization is thus a consequence or the ultimate result of approximations of the lexifier. Now, let's move on to psycholinguistic processes in Creolization. The first process is called reduction. Reduction. Creoles generally have some aspects of phonology that are reduced in comparison to their lexifiers. For examples, in Shranan, unlike its lexifier English, has only a 5-vowel system, and many consonant clusters are reduced. For example, tan from the word stand, and tini from the word stink. Creoles also have some areas of morphosyntax in which they demonstrate reduction of inflection or mark grammatical categories in comparison to their lexifiers. For example, the Cape Verde Creole, unlike Portuguese, has only one set of pronouns, which can function as subjects, objects, or possessives, while native varieties show variable use of the ed past tense suffix. This suffix is absent in English lexified Creoles, thus illustrating one example of lack of continuity. It seems clear that in the context of Creolization, such structural reduction is the result of preliminary second language acquisition that occurred in the early stages of development. Describing the findings of the European Science Foundation project on adult second language acquisition done in the 1980s, Klein and Perdue 1997 report that the interlanguage of all the learners went through a stage referred to as the basic variety. Basic variety, as defined by Klein and Perdue, is understood as an instantiation of the essential properties of the human language capacity, and although, as the initial fossilization point of adult second language acquisition, it lacks crucial features of fully fledged languages. The claim is that the BV is a natural language in the sense that it is constrained by principles of universal grammar. The basic variety, as conceived by Klein and Perdue, is a relatively stable state in the process of spontaneous adult second language acquisition, characterized by a small set of phrasal, semantic, and pragmatic principles. Summarize the BV as follows. Strikingly, absent from the BV are free or bound morphemes with purely grammatical function. For example, instead of tense and aspect markers, lexical items such as adverbs are used. This stage is similar to what van der Kratz, Korver, and Van Hout call the content word state. These characteristics also apply to restricted pidgins. For example, before used to indicate past tense in early Hawaii Pidgin English. In this sentence, Garni before eat too much wayawa pineapple, now get sore tooth. While in English, it could be presented as this. Garni ate so much wayawa pineapple that his teeth now hurt. The second process is transfer. While some aspects of Creole phonology and morphosyntax are reduced, others are as complex or more complex than those of their lexifiers. In the development of some Creoles, acquisition of the lexifier went through beyond the basic variety stage, and in rare cases, there is continuity with a grammatical morpheme from the lexifier coming into the Creole. For example, the English progressive suffix ing or in is found in Hawaii Creole, as in he helping me, that's from Siegel 2008. Further evidence that more advanced second language acquisition was involved in Hawaii Creole is in overgeneralization, such as the form mains, which is mines, for mine, analogous to his, hers, ours, and theirs. Other grammatical expansion found in Creoles was the result of language internal development, such as the grammaticalization of by and by to the future or arealis marker by in Tokpisin. There is evidence of phonological, lexical, and semantic transfer that may have occurred in the early stages of second language acquisition. In phonology, for example, the Australian Creole has a number of retroflex and laminopalatal consonants found in the Aboriginal substrate languages, but not in the lexifier English. Similarly, Saramaccan, another English lexified Creole, another lexified English Creole spoken in Suriname, has voice implosive consonants k and d, found in the West African substrate languages. That's according to Smith and Habu 2008. Concerning the lexicon, most Creoles have some words from the substrate languages. For example, in Hawaii Creole, akamai means smart and pau, finish, from Hawaiian, and taco means octopus from Japanese. They also have hybrids and loan translations, such as the following from West African substrate languages in English lexified Caribbean Creoles. Obiamaman, or magic man or sorcerer, and eye water, which means tears, sweet mouth, which means flutter, and big eye is for greedy. With regard to grammatical expansion in Creoles, however, the most common type of transfer appears to be the kind of functional transfer, where the functions of a grammatical morpheme in a substrate language have been applied to a non-grammatical morpheme of the lexifier language. For example, in Hetaean Creole, the functions of the pre-verbal interior marker in one of the substrate languages, fongbi, have been transferred to the French it, shortened to te. Just like in these following examples, In Haitian Creole, the sentence is Mari te prepare pat, wherein in Fongbe, it sounds like this, Mari ko dawa, or Mary had prepared though. In English, Mary had prepared though. In Bislama, the Vanuatu dialect of Melanesian Pidgin, grammatical morphemes derived from English blong corresponds to belong. I for he and M for him and them have taken on the functions of key grammatical morphemes from the Central Eastern Oceanic substrate languages, here represented by Kwayo possessive marker, subject referencing pronoun, and transitive suffix. Just like this sentence in Bislama, woman blang mi e mekem yestad in Kwayo no ni ago ka e gina abuni. Or in English, it means my wife did it yesterday. In Hawaii Creole, the English word stay has the grammatical functions of Portuguese estar, that is copula for locations, and non-intrinsic attributes and markers of progressive aspect, as in these examples. The book stay on top the table, or the book is on the table. The water stay cold, the water is cold. John stay writing one letter, where John is writing a letter. Evidence of other kinds of morphosyntactic transfer also exists in Creoles. For example, the use of reduplication for various functions in Bislama, as in Singapore English referred to above, parallel to that found in some of the CEO substrate languages, as in these examples from Crowley, 1990, with verbs to indicate continuous, repeated, or habitual action. Tufala is raw-raw, di tuk-tuk, e no finish yet. It means they argued on, and the discussion isn't over yet. In this sentence, Pikinini ay stop haham alboat longyad, or the child jumped all over the yard. Joseph is stop giagaman or taim no mo. Joseph always lies. With adjectives to indicate intensity or modify plural nouns. Skin blong you, iwa et iwat bakigin. Your skin has gone really pale again. All ino stop salim, long fala timba o steam. Or they don't sell long planks like that. The transfer of word order can also be seen in Creoles. An example comes from one of the relativization strategies used in Hawaii Creole, which appears to be the result of the influence of Cantonese, a major substrate language in Hawaii. The position of the relative pronoun here, kain or kain, follows the modifying relative clause, as one does in Singapore English. But the modifying clause itself precedes the head as well, reflecting the syntax of Chinese languages, as shown with Cantonese above, for example, according from Sigil. In the sentences, this one I gotta tell my friends about Kain movie, wherein that's one I gotta tell my friends about Kain movie, wherein in English that's a movie that I've got to tell my friends about. There is also evidence of transfer of conceptual categories. For example, the CEO languages generally have pronoun systems that distinguish singular, dual, trial, and plural number, as well as inclusive and exclusive in first person, non-singular. The same system is found in Bislama, as what you can see in the examples below. Although this kind of transfer by individuals is responsible for some of the features of native varieties, it appears to have occurred to a much greater degree in the development of Creoles. This is not surprising for the following reasons. First, we have seen that transfer occurs in the direction from the dominant source language, in terms of proficiency, to the weaker recipient language. Clearly, in the evolution of Creole, speakers' knowledge of the lexifier language was very weak. Second, we have seen that transfer is a compensatory strategy in second language use, using knowledge from the first language to fill a gap in communicative competence when using the second language. The role of transfer in gap filling, that is developing a new morphological category where there was previously no equivalent category, is well accepted in studies of contact-induced language change. That's according to Heine and Koteva 2005, and Thomason 2001, and Winford 2003. Here, the gap is not in the knowledge of individual speakers, but in the developing contact language itself. In the context of Creolization, however, speakers of the substrate languages had very little access to the colonial language, or they did not wish to access it, for reasons of maintaining a separate identity. Thus, they had to use different strategies to expand their restricted pidgin or individual interlanguage, and one of these was transfer from their first languages without input from the lexifier language. Transferred structures that led to successful communication continued to be used, and as more and more transferred structures entered people's speech, their grammars became less and less like that of the lexifier. On the other hand, in Creolization, functional transfer leading to morphological augmentation is constrained as it is in Indigenization. For example, Cantonese has several post-verbal aspect markers, including habitual in addition to those for perfect, increative, continuous, and experiential found in other varieties of Chinese. In Hawaii Creole, as in Singapore English, already has become a post-verbal marker of perfect or completive aspect as in the following. In this sentence, she stay shame already. Or in English, she stay shame already. But in formal English, she was ashamed. The taco no come in already, Olowalo side. The octopus doesn't come to the Olowalo area anymore. Again, transfer of substrate property to already was not constrained because this adverb, like the Cantonese perfect marker, follows the verb. But there are no post-verbal adverbs that could have been somewhere to transfer to for the other aspect markers. For instance, always or usually could be interpreted as indicating habitual aspects, but they occur pre-verbally. In another example, 7 out of 11 core features of the CEO substrate languages are found in Melanesian Pidgin, presumably as the result of transfer by individuals at an earlier stage of development. 3 of the 4 features that are absent are ones that seem to have had no place to transfer to in English. That is, no salient morpheme in the same surface syntactic position that could have been interpreted as having the same function. It is again from Siegel in 1999. Now, let's move on to sociolinguistic processes in Creole formation, emergence of new norms. As with indigenous varieties, norms emerge in Creoles through a process of mixing and leveling. When speakers are expanding their pidgin language or individual interlanguages, reduced features are used alongside more complex features both learned from the lexifier and transferred from the substrate languages. All of this make up the pool of variants that are used for communication. With the emergence of a new community identity, focusing begins and some leveling occurs so that some features are eliminated, while others are retained. However, more rapid and comprehensive leveling occurs when the pool of variants become the primary input for children's first language acquisition. Children retain and regularize some variants, but not others, and this form the grammar of the Creole. In some Creoles, however, leveling may be incomplete, as different grammatical strategies transferred from different substrate languages are retained for the same function, as with relativization in Hawaii Creole. Also, as in the formation of indigenous varieties, the variants most likely to be retained are those that are reinforced by being most frequently used, although other factors such as salience and semantic transparency play a role as well. The difference between Creoles and indigenous varieties is that reduced and transferred features not found in the lexifier are much more frequent in Creolization than in Indigenization. This is the result, as mentioned above, of speakers not targeting the lexifier language and expansion because they do not have access to it or because they do not wish to emulate its speakers. However, Creoles do differ among themselves in the degree of continuity they have with their lexifiers, and these differences often correspond to the degree of access to the lexifier, and thus the proportion of lexifier features that enter the pool of variants. Hawaii Creole, for example, not only uses the ing progressive prefix, but also has variable s for plural marking and other features of English grammar, making it similar in some ways to indigenous varieties. In Hawaii, the creators of the Creole had more access to English through formal education and interaction with English speakers that found in other Creole contexts. At the other extreme is Shranan, which has virtually no features of English phonology or grammar. In Suriname, English was the colonial language for less than 17 years. It is on 1651 to 1667, after which it was replaced by Dutch. Finally, as in indigenous varieties, some features were reallocated social functions or meanings during the leveling that occurred in the emergence of Creoles, and there is frequently a continuum ranging from basilec, with features furthest from the lexifier, to acrolec, closest to the lexifier, with mesolex in between. As with indigenous varieties, there may be a relationship between speakers, social class, and the range of the continuum they can use, but it is the range from basilec to mesolec that is used to project a more local identity. So in conclusion to our topic, Creolization, as phenomena arising from language contact, indigenization and creolization have a lot in common, especially with regard to processes of reduction and overgeneralization in second language acquisition and transfer in second language use. The end results of the two phenomena, these indigenous varieties are also referred to as non-native varieties or native varieties, and Creoles are a consequence of both individual and societal multilingualism. However, in the case of the most typical indigenous varieties, it was multilingualism with substrate languages and a colonial language, while in the case of typical Creoles, it was substrate languages with a newly emerging contact language, for which the colonial language provided the lexicon and little else. Of course, these typical varieties are two ends of a spectrum, with a good deal of variety in between, depending on the frequency and degree of the processes involved.